Today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations that are in factored form, and we're going to start with something called the zero product property. So this is what the zero product property says. It says if you have two numbers, we'll call them A and B for now because they can be anything. If A times B equals 0, then either A is 0 or B is 0, or possibly both, but at least one of those numbers has to be 0. So 0 is kind of a special number, it's the only one this works for, but it says if you multiply two numbers together and the answer is 0, then at least one of those numbers had to be 0. That's the only way that can happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the zero product property to solve equations. So let's do it. We have this equation, it's in factored form, that's what we're doing today. And we have an equation x plus 5 times x minus 3. And it equals 0. So if you think about it, this is the zero product property. This x plus 5 right here, this is like what we called A in the zero product property, and this x minus 3 is B. Remember, each one of those is a number. X plus 5 is a number. We don't know what that number is unless we know what x is. But for example, if x was 10, then the first number is 15, 10 plus 5. And the second number is 7, 10 minus 3. So each one of those are a number. So what we have is the zero product property. A times B equals 0. So we can separate it. We can say either the first one, x plus 5 equals 0, or the second one, x minus 3 equals 0. And we can solve those very easily. Each one is one step. The first one, if I subtract 5 from each side, we end up with x equals negative 5. And for the second one, if you add 3 to both sides to cancel out that minus 3, you end up with x equals 3. And those would be the answers to this question. Either x equals negative 5 or x equals 3. They're both the answer. So basically, that's an example of how the zero product property can be used to solve equations in factored form. So what I want you guys to do right now, I took an equation, kind of similar to the one we just did. I broke it apart and I solved it for x. I want you guys to pause the video right now for a second, look through the work very carefully, decide whether or not you think those answers are right, and if so, why they are or why they are not if you think it's wrong. So pause the video right now and think about it. All right, I'm going to assume you guys did that, and let's talk about it together. Now, first of all, the answer to the question, let's just start off with the answer. Is this right? No, these are not the right answers. Now, the reason is this right here is not 0. Remember, what we're doing, it's called the zero product property for a reason. This only works for the number 0. If I have two numbers and I multiply them together and the answer is 0, then one of them has to be 0. But if I have two numbers and I multiply them together and the answer is 6, there's a lot of different things those answers could be. The first one could be 1 and the second one could be 6. Or the first one could be 2 and the second one could be 3. Or you could have fractions. The first one could be 12 and the second one could be 1/2. There actually are an infinite number of possible things that those can be. So none of this work is right. We would have to do something different to solve this one. But the important thing that you guys realize is you can only use this type of work when the equation is equal to 0. So if you want to use the zero product property, if you want to separate two equations and solve them, they have to be equal to 0 first. Now I'm going to add one little thing here before we talk about how we're going to do the full problem. In different worksheets, you're going to see these different vocab words. The answer to a question like this could be called a solution. It could also be called a zero or a root. Now solution, we use that word. Solution means answer. But if you ever see a question that says find the zeros, it's asking you to solve it. And really it comes from the zero product property. Find the zeros means set it equal to 0 and solve. Roots is another one that has to do more with graphing. That's usually when we talk about intercepts. But those are all the same thing. So keeping that in mind, we're going to go to our main concept for today, and that's solving by factoring. So if you want to do that, if you want to solve a quadratic equation by factoring, here are the steps. Number one, make the equation equal to 0. We just talked about how important that is. If it's already equal to 0, if it says the equation equals 0, great, you're ready for step 2. But if the equation equals something else, if it equals 10, you need to subtract 10 from both sides and cancel that out. You need to cancel everything from one side of the equation, so there's nothing left, and once there's nothing left, then the equation is equal to 0. Okay, once the equation is equal to 0, we're going to talk about factoring. Now remember, we learned two different types of factoring. The first one is common terms, so you always want to check for that one first. You want to say like, oh, could I divide by 2? If you can divide each term by 2, do that, factor it out. Or can I divide each term by x? If you can do that, definitely do it. If there are common terms, do that. If not, move to step 3. Step 3 is called factoring a trinomial. That's what we normally think of when we factor. And that's what actually makes you able to use the zero product property. It turns it into x plus this times x minus that. And then you use the zero product property to solve it. You separate it into two easy equations and you solve. So let's try one out. We're going to solve this equation for x. 7x squared minus 70 equals 21x. So right off the bat, I notice this is not equal to 0. I can't solve it the way it's written. I need to move some things around. So I need to cancel out everything from one side of the equation. The easiest way to do that is to just cancel out that 21x. So I'm going to subtract 21x from both sides of the equation. Now I wrote it on the one side. On the other side, I kind of don't have a place for it. Remember, you always want to line x squareds with x squareds, x's with x's, and numbers with numbers. Now, I don't have an x term. I want it in between those two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of squeeze that negative 21x right in between the two and just put it in the middle. We'll leave the 7x squared. We'll put the minus 21x in the middle, and then we'll leave the minus 70. So I squeezed that negative 21x. I was subtracting 21x from both sides. I didn't have a place for it, so I just put it in between. So we always go in order from x squared to x to number. All right, so I have it equal to 0. That was step 1. Step 2 says, let's look for common terms to factor out. And I think I can divide by 7. If I look at the coefficients, I have a 7, a 21, and a 70. Those can all be divided by 7. So let's do that. Let's divide each of these by 7. And remember, what that does is it brings it out front. So let's see what's left over after we divide it out. The first one, the 7s are gone, just leaves x squared. The second one, it's a minus. 21 divided by 7 is 3. We have our x term. And for my constant term, it's minus again. 70 divided by 7 is 10. So now I've factored out my common terms. Well, I got it equal to 0, factored out my common terms. Now for our next step, we're ready to try and do this type of factor. Now for this part of the question, we are looking for two numbers that multiply together to give me negative 10 and add together to give you negative 3. Now, when we first learned how to do this question, I had you guys make the list and look for your choices. As you get more and more practice and it gets easier for you, you can start running through them in your head. And what I see is a negative 5 and a positive 2. I'm going to pick these two numbers because negative 5 times positive 2 is negative 10, and negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. So I found my two answers. So now we're finally ready to solve. I'm ready to do the zero product property. I don't have to worry about the 7 because remember, we're trying to figure out what would make this thing equal to 0. A 7 is just a 7. It's never going to equal 0. So that means that either this one right here or this one right here equals 0. Because remember, it's a multiplication problem. It's 7 times x minus 5 times x plus 2. If the answer to that question is 0, which it is, then one of those things has to be 0. Well, a 7 is not a 0, it's a 7. So one of the other two things is. So we're going to set those equal to 0 separately. I'm going to kind of try and find some space here. Let's do x minus 5 equals 0, and I'll do x plus 2 equals 0. I'm finding some space on my slide here. So for the first one, we'll add 5 to both sides, and my first answer is x equals 5. Now for my second one, we will subtract 2 from each side, and my second answer is x equals negative 2. And those are our answers. And that's how solving by factoring works. So I made a problem specifically for the notes that showed every step. Remember, you don't have to do all 4 steps in every question. You're going to see some questions that are already equal to 0 and you can skip step 1. You're going to see some questions where you don't have any common terms to factor out. You can skip step 2. You usually have to do step 3 and 4. So basically, in dark blue, I got it equal to 0. In green, I factored out common terms. In purple, I did the ordinary factoring, factored trinomial. And then in red, I separated and solved using the zero product property.